To introduce our guest and host today's conversation, we have Karen Lynn Greenberg, Associate Professor of English at Siena College. Her 2013 story collection, Faulty Predictions, won the Flannery O'Connor Award in short fiction, and her 2023 novel, You Are Here, about life at an upstate shopping mall, appeared on dozens of best of lists, from Oprah Daily to the Washington Post to Elle magazine. Publishers Weekly called it a remarkable study of ordinary people's extraordinary inner lives. Please welcome Michal Luo and Karen Lynn Greenberg.
So I'm happy to have the opportunity today to introduce Michal Luo and be in conversation with him. Luo is an executive editor at The New Yorker and is the author of the book we'll discuss today, Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America, which was published this past April by Doubleday. Before joining The New Yorker in 2016, Luo spent 13 years at The New York Times as a Metro reporter, correspondent, and investigative reporter and editor. Under his editorship, his reporters were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize 4 times. He has also written for the Associated Press, Newsday, and the Los Angeles Times. Luo is a recipient of a George Polk Award for criminal justice reporting and a Livingston Award for young journalists. At The New Yorker, Luo regularly writes about politics, religion, and Asian American issues. Strangers in the Land examines the history of the Chinese in America starting in the middle of the 19th century when Chinese arrived in California during the gold rush, and ends in 1965 when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Immigration and Nationality Act, which ended a system of national origin quotas that severely limited Chinese from entering the country. The book traces over 100 years of Chinese immigration to America, the efforts of Chinese to build lives in this country, and the reception to the Chinese, which often included hostility, violence, and exclusionary laws. What makes Strangers in the Land a unique and outstanding work of history is that Luo not only delves into laws and policies and monumental newsmaking events, but also includes the stories of hundreds of people, both people who came from China or Chinese, people who were born here, who sought work and opportunities in America, and who often hope to forge new lives here. These are individual stories that Luo uncovered through meticulous research. These stories vividly illustrate the hardships these people encountered, the connections they are able to make in this new land, and the resilience they demonstrated in a country that often behaved with hostility toward them. This book reminds us that history is not just made up of legal documents and wars and occupying both new and existing territories, but rather history consists of stories about individual people, and often stories about ordinary people who wouldn't appear on the front page of newspapers. In the Washington Post, Makana Iyer writes, "Strangers in the Land is more than a story of an immigrant group accepting a wretched fate. Luo wisely puts the human experience at the center of his narrative. He restores a voice to the forgotten men and women who endured endless broadsides in their adoption of a new country." Kirkus Review says, "Readers interested in American history, not only Chinese American history, will savor these pages," and calls the book an estimable and vital work of history that honors the Chinese American experience. Please join me in welcoming Michal Luo. For those who have not read the book, you write about an incident in 2016 that happened to you that was the catalyst for this book. So could you just start by talking about that incident and then talk about how that led to the piece you wrote for the New York Times, and then how that led to, I think you said 3 years of research and writing that ultimately led to this book?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for that lovely introduction. It's great to be back in the capital region, and where I spent a lot of my formative years, really. My old Chinese school teacher is here, Niu Su, and so and his wife, Niu Ai, and so it's really cool to be here. In terms of that story, this was the fall of 2016, October. Trump was about to be elected. We weren't expecting this, actually, but you could feel kind of a curtain of nativism, I think, descending in the country. In the city of New York and around the country, I think. The moment was just an ordinary moment, really. It was a Sunday after church. My family, I have 2 kids, we were with some other families. We were on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and a woman was annoyed that we were blocking the sidewalk, and she brushed past us, and then as she brushed past us, she said, "Go back to China," and this is a Sunday after church. Not my proudest moment. I did not turn the other cheek, and I abandoned my younger daughter in her stroller and ran down the sidewalk and kind of got in the woman's face. And I was kind of just going back and forth with her. I was essentially kind of saying, "Are you serious? Like, did you just say that?" And then we were just going back and forth, and then she screamed down the block. This was like broad daylight, and she's, "Go back to your effing country." And I was trying to come up with the adrenaline's flowing through you, and I'm trying to come up with a smart response. And I said, "I was born in this country," and it felt so pathetic. And I ended up tweeting about this. This is back when Twitter was a thing, and this kind of a series of tweets, and I used the hashtag "This is 2016" because I was kind of trying to make the observation that, can you believe it, that this is the year 2016, this kind of thing is still happening. And then that ended up going viral. I remember Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York back then, kind of tweeted back at me. He was like, "Mike, you're welcome in New York anytime," or something along those lines. And I wrote a piece for the New York Times that was an open letter to this woman, just kind of writing about this feeling of otherizing that is common in the Asian American experience. And I wrote also about just this feeling of sadness I had felt as I was walking away that day with my kids, and just they're 2 generations removed from my parents' immigrant experience, and just wondering whether they would ever feel like they truly belonged in this country. And so that was that ran on the front page of the New York Times, that open letter, which is an extraordinary thing, and it became a real sort of moment, I think, for Asian Americans. And I was suddenly, I joke about this, I felt like I was for a couple of weeks the face of Asian America. Like I was on Morning Joe, I was doing all these panels and interviews, and the thing about it was I felt a bit of imposter syndrome. I was just like this guy who had this thing happen to me on the street, and I wrote this little thing, and I was being asked to kind of talk about and contextualize the Asian American experience. And I just remember I was on a panel with Jelani Cobb, who is now my colleague at the New Yorker, who is a historian by training. If you know Jelani, he speaks in these rolling paragraphs, eloquent, full of context and history and knowledge about the Black experience in America. And I went after him, and I just realized I actually was ill-equipped to talk about the Asian American experience, and that stuck with me. It was actually a few years later. I then went to the New Yorker. I was busy, had a new job, and then the pandemic happened, and then we had the surge in violence against Asian Americans, and I wrote a piece for the New Yorker, actually, that touched on some of this history that I actually wasn't that familiar with, and that is what led to the book. And so really, the book is kind of my multi-year effort to come up with a retort to this woman, and so now if I saw this woman again, I would now be able to hand her this book.
I think you should read it.
I hope so. I hope so.
So to follow up on what you're saying about Asian American history, as I was reading your book, I was struck by how so much of U.S. history, including legal history, like the ability to become a naturalized citizen, who can vote, who can testify in court, who can work in this country, is also the history of the Chinese in America. So can you talk about some of the history of the Chinese in America that you write about that runs parallel to what we learn in school about American history that's perhaps been left out of textbooks?
Totally, yeah. I have a a daughter who's a junior in high school, so she's taking AP US History, a push as they call it. And I actually, her teacher had recommended that she buy this course book, that kind of gives you an overview of what's in AP US History. And so I was just curious. I flipped to the back to the index to see if there are any mentions of Chinese. There's only one mention of Chinese in this entire AP US History course book. Is of the Chinese Exclusion Act. I flipped to the Chinese Exclusion Act section, and it kind of described, there was kind of a slight error in the way they described it. And so that was it. That was no other mentions. The thing that's incredible, and I write about this in the introduction to the book, and I hope that people keep it in mind as they're reading through, is this history, particularly the late 19th century, early 20th century, this was like a crucial period of formation for America. This was the post-Reconstruction period. This was a time when, these ideals that we, stood for and fought a war over were kind of being set aside. The Reconstruction was being vanquished in the South. There were horrific acts of violence committed against indigenous people in the West, driving them off their land and eradicating Native Americans. This history of the Chinese in America, the exclusionary laws directed the Chinese, this was all happening around the same time and needs to be kind of considered all together, and there are historians now who are actually really trying to make that point, and that all of this you need to be thinking about all of this history together.
Yeah, something that I was struck by, you talk about public schools, and I was thinking about what we learn about segregation in public schools in our textbooks, and you talk about how Chinese people were not allowed to send their children to public schools despite paying taxes, and eventually a separate school for Chinese children was opened in San Francisco in the late 1880s.
Yep.
I was thinking back to when I was in school and learning about segregation, and it was always presented in terms of separation of black and white students. So I was just curious to hear just a little bit, if you could just talk a little bit about segregation in schooling. And just, did you hear from a lot of readers who read this book saying, I'm learning about all these parts of American history that were just kind of maybe erased a little bit? Totally.
Yeah, the story, the chapter you're talking about is the story of the Tape family, which is an incredible story. The husband and wife, Joe Tape and his wife, married. She was raised in an orphan kind of home where she was. I think she ended up there when she was very young, and so as a result, she only spoke English. And Joe Tape, his name in Cantonese was Joe Dip, and he made it westernized, and he called himself Joe Tape. And they courted in English because that was their common language, and they married, and then they had children, and it was the story of Mammy Tape, who was I think she was 8 years old, and they lived outside of the Chinese Quarter in San Francisco, and they just wanted to go to school in the school down the street from them, and so they showed up and they wanted to go attend the school, and the principal wouldn't let them. And that led to this lawsuit that actually made its way to the California Supreme Court. And in the end, the California Supreme Court ruled positively in their favor that they needed to be able to attend these schools. And what happened instead was San Francisco school officials ended up creating a separate school for Orientals. They call it the Oriental School. And so they had to go to that school, and so they ended up not integrating the schools. So yeah, it's an incredible. When you read, one of the things I'm most proud of in the book is when you're a writer, you're trying to tell a story, and and you need protagonists in your story, and that can be challenging when you're writing about this history, because history is written by the powerful, and the powerless are often left out of history. And so you have to work hard to, it's like mining for gold. The gold rush is what opens this book. And anytime I was able to find, the details, the kind of vignettes, the color, as we call it in journalism, that to create characters, I really glommed onto that. And the Tape family has this kind of incredible arc. Mei Nai, who is a giant in the field of Asian American history, wrote a whole book about the multi-generational Tape family. It's an incredible saga.
Yeah, I think for me as a reader, hearing these individual stories, I think was just profoundly moving and helped me understand the history, I think, in a way that's just very, very different from text.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The people might be intimidated by this large book. I will point out that it's 160,000 words, 40,000 words of endnotes. And so like a quarter of that isn't. You don't have to read that. It's just there to point other people who come after me, to the archives. I'll just tell one little story about just how it reads. I'll tell the story because I have some old family friends here. The first person to read the entire book through, from beginning to end, was my dad, who is an immigrant. English is not his first language. He's an engineer. But the book existed in computer printouts. Every time I finished a chapter, I print it out, stick it in this folder. And then I have a twin brother. We, every July 4th week, we would go out to my parents' place, and they live out in New Jersey. And he just saw this pile of printouts, and he just started reading. And then he just kept reading. And so he read a chapter a day, and then he finished it. And that was, to me, my first sign that I had pulled it off, because that was the thing that you work, you're lost in the trees of this thing. And a big thing that I was worried about was, does it all hang together? Because the way the book is constructed, it's kind of a 25 magazine stories kind of connected together, and you are the protagonists of the book are the Chinese people as a whole, and some characters kind of persist throughout a couple of chapters, but there isn't this central character that runs through the entire book, but it's the Chinese people who do that. And my dad was the first person to really confirm to me that I had pulled off what I was trying to do as a storyteller.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the storytelling and just how you did that research. You write about a 27-year-old Chinese immigrant named Tom Chong Quan, who kept a daily diary where he jotted down a few lines about what he'd done each day. And you write, for modern readers, the entries are like pottery shards, glazed with the pathos of the Chinese immigrant experience. Piece them together, and the entire vase comes into view. And I just love this image of these shards, these little pieces coming together to create a whole. And I think this comparison works with what you've done in the book by finding all these stories and putting them together to create this history. There's clearly an astronomical amount of research in the book. That's why there's over 100 pages of notes. So could you just talk about your research process? Where did you go to do your research? What kinds of documents did you look at? Did you research first and then write? Did you research and write simultaneously? Just the whole process.
Yeah. So an important actually bit of background is I have a busy day job at the New Yorker, and editors at magazines and editors of newspapers, people who run publications, love it when their writers win prizes for their books, but they hate it when their writers take book leave. And so when I when I got this the contract for this book, David Remnick, my boss, he said to me, I think he was trying to be supportive, but there was an edge here. Was what he said? What you do at 2 a.m., Mike, is none of my business. But I actually never took leave. I thought I might, but I have a job that it's hard to do that, and so. But I was lucky in some interesting ways. So I signed the contract to write this book in the summer of 2021. We were still in the pandemic. And so my wife and I were working remotely. My kids were still going to school remotely. And we ended up moving to California for a little over a month and just renting an Airbnb near my brother, actually, who was out in San Francisco. And I was then able to go to a lot of the archives in the Bay Area, and that's everywhere from like the Bancroft Library, the Ethnic Studies Library. There are all these historical societies out in these gold mining towns in California, which are extraordinary resources. I can't believe they still survive. Places like Truckee and Nevada City, and so I just went on this like month-long thing where I'm just like photographing boxes of documents. I went down to the Huntington Library, which is an extraordinary resource in LA. And so that kind of run of through all those archives was kind of foundational for the book. But I worked one chapter at a time. Each chapter is its own research expedition, and it was too much to do like all the research and then go back. Basically, that archive run in the beginning was the foundation, but then so like for example, if I'm doing the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre, which is this horrific event that happened in 1871 where I think it was 19 Chinese men who were killed. Most of them were lynched. It's one of the worst mass lynchings in American history, which is pretty extraordinary because you think of lynchings as a phenomenon that affected Black Americans, but this is one of the most horrific mass lynchings in American history and related to Chinese immigrants. And so when I'm in that chapter, what I'm doing is I'm creating. So before I sat down to write that chapter, I created this chronology in Evernote, which is just the system that I used, where I'm basically taking all of these PDFs and cutting them up, and like they're like if there's a line from a newspaper account, or if there was a memoir or some other document, I just put that all in order. And so then before I sat down to write, for each chapter I had this chronology. The other thing I'll say about archives is archives just come from some surprising places. One of my the best places that I went was there's Presbyterian Historical Society of America is in Philadelphia. And why was the Presbyterian Historical Society of America so important? Again, very glad that it exists. It's because that a lot of the best remembrances of the Chinese in the 19th century came from missionaries from churches that were sent to California to evangelize the Chinese. And so these missionaries every 2 weeks wrote letters back home to the mission board. And so one of my characters in the second chapter is this guy named William Spear. And he just wrote these wonderful letters, detailed letters. And he ended up playing this really interesting role as a translator at a trial where some white men were accused of killing some Chinese miners, and what ended up resulting from that court case was the California Supreme Court ruling that Chinese testimony was inadmissible in court against a white man. And the reason that it ended up being a sort of subject of debate was the law said that testimony of black people and Indian or Native American or indigenous people were not allowed, but Chinese were not specified. And so it was this discussion of like, are Chinese white or black or what do they count as? And in the end, it was ruled that Chinese testimony was inadmissible. And so how do I kind of bring that chapter to life? William Spear is like this kind of protagonist who runs through that chapter. And he's really interesting because he was this great champion of the Chinese and stood up in a really brave way for them. But he also had, just really kind of ugly views to a certain extent because, he saw the Chinese as heathens. Just the way that the language that missionaries sometimes spoke of the Chinese was problematic, and so his whole story. In the end, he actually didn't manage to convert many people, but he was kind of one of these flawed heroes, on behalf of the Chinese.
One of the words you've been using is protagonist, which I think is really interesting to think about in a book of history, because I think it's a word we think about with novels maybe. And one of the ways I felt that this book felt novelistic was how visual it was. You had lots of just descriptions of people and places, what somebody's hair looked like, what their clothes looked like. And I was curious about that. How did you find those things out in your research? Was it from photographs or from journals, diaries?
Yeah, I think all of those things. I'm trying to think of in specific examples. I mean, so photographs were just an amazing thing if you were able to come across them. In some cases, though, they were very haunting to me because there's this one chapter that's built around this book of photographs that I found at an archive at the California Historical Society. It was it's almost like a collection of mugshots of like 170 Chinese, and so you're at these archives, and then you take out this book of photographs, and photographs are incredibly personal and intimate, but yet it's very frustrating because you don't know their stories, and then when you start to study this book, you started to pull out clues. And so what it was, and one of the kind of discoveries of the book was figuring out what this book was. It was actually a constable in this county where so the Chinese Exclusion Act is actually not a single law. It was actually a succession of laws that were passed that were kind of increasingly onerous. And so one of the iterations of the Chinese exclusion law that was passed was called the Geary Act, and it required all Chinese to register. The Chinese actually fought this law and took it all the way to the Supreme Court and lost. And in the end, they did register, and one of the requirements was they have their photographs taken. And so this constable, you had the whole story actually once you found it in the Mountain Messenger. There was he had like a brother-in-law who came to town, and he had a photo studio, and then he took pictures of more than 100 Chinese, and there were just clues of kind of just sprinkled throughout this book. There was like a woman in the beginning where there's a mention of a son, and then so a couple of pages later you find the son, and it was the thing that was eerie about the book though was this guy wasn't required to kind of surveil the Chinese, but essentially what you figured out was this was a book of surveillance. So he was tracking these people, the Chinese in his community over years, decades, and so you just see these notations of this person went back to China to never return again, or died, murdered, burned, these. So it was just like this, but you looked at the people in these stories, and you wonder what happened to them, and what were their descendants like. And the book is online now, and the way they derive, the way they spell Chinese names is all over the place, and so I don't know how useful it is from a genealogical perspective, but they were very intentional about listing all the names in case that one day maybe somebody could learn these stories. But in terms of your question about the details, like that's it. Like if there was any document, a newspaper account, a memoir, or a letter where I was able to kind of pull identifying details that made them a character, that was gold to me.
Yeah, I think as a reader, I think those really stuck out to me, and I really appreciated those. So thank you for that hard work. So you mentioned the massacre in Los Angeles, and the book details a long history of physical violence against the Chinese, starting with the gold miners, and then including not only the massacre in Los Angeles, but also at Rock Springs in the Wyoming Territory. So could you just talk about that thread of violence that runs throughout the history of the Chinese in America?
Yeah, I mean, this was the American West. Like when you think of like the Wild West, when you see it depicted on movies and TV, if there are no Chinese in that movie or TV show, that's wrong. Actually, there is a show. It's actually a good show, The Warrior, which is on, I think, Showtime. And some of the stories you can actually recognize some historical figures in them, including like this kind of demagogue-like figure named Dennis Carney, who was an Irishman who started to rally kind of an anti-Chinese movement and would deliver these speeches on the Sandlot near San Francisco City Hall, where he would end his speeches, "The Chinese must go." Basically, the emotional heart of the book is kind of 3/4 of the way in, and it's this period called the driving out. And I always kind of saw that this was going to be the center of the book, and I was. What I saw in Chinese American history was a narrative arc. Actually, history doesn't always line up that way, but what I saw was this protagonist, the Chinese people, kind of confronting a series of obstacles, and this is like the kind of stereotypical screenplay where you have a protagonist who confronts this kind of the series of complications, and then there's kind of this climactic sort of moment, and then it's kind of resolved, and then the tension kind of falls. It reminds me of, I don't know, I talked about this in an interview once about the book. Like I was watching K-pop Demon Hunters with my younger daughter, and then at a certain point you're like, uh-oh, what's going to happen? And I'm like, don't worry, it's going to get resolved. That's the way screenplays, these things work. But with the Chinese, like basically the rising sort of tension is like all these efforts, particularly beginning in the 1870s when there's this economic downturn that really kind of caused this kind of movement of restive white unemployed or underemployed white working men and small business owners to kind of get together and really focus their ire on the scapegoat, the Chinese. And what happened was that it resulted ultimately in the first Chinese exclusion law, which was passed in 1882. But the Chinese kept coming. They found ways around the law. It was the Chinese Exclusion Act was targeting Chinese laborers, and so if you were somehow able to prove that you were a merchant, you were able to get around the law. If you were able to say that you were an American citizen born in the country, you were able to get around the law. And so what ended up happening is 1885, 1886, there are nearly 200 communities in the American West. Is almost like a domino effect. something caused this cascade, and the Rock Springs massacre was kind of one of the real kind of inciting events. Rock Springs is where nearly, I think it was nearly 30 Chinese miners were killed, and so the historians now call this period the driving out. And what these communities were doing was they were like, okay, if this law is not working, we're going to take matters into our own hands, and they were expelling the Chinese from their communities. But the kind of resolution in my case, the climactic sort of thing, is like they didn't succeed. The Chinese persisted. They were there is this story of resilience in the book, and in a lot of cases, the Chinese returned to these communities. There was a kind of an American-born generation that started to emerge. The Chinese community was shrinking in population all up through the 1920s, and then the numbers started to rise again. And the book goes all the way up into the 1960s when this quota system that really limited Chinese immigration and Asian immigration was finally abolished, and so it really is a story of resilience of a people.
Yeah. So let me. I'll ask one final question. I have many more questions. But I have people probably have questions here, but I did want to ask about the resilience. I was especially struck by a chapter titled Ruin and Rebirth about the earthquake in San Francisco in 1906 and its aftermath.
Mm-hmm.
And so could you talk about what happened in Chinatown after the earthquake and that idea of rebirth and resilience that you write about?
Yeah, I mean the earthquake in San Francisco, leveled China, but it was the fires afterwards that really destroyed the Chinese Quarter and much of the rest of San Francisco. It's a really important moment in Chinese immigration history because after this, there was a real increase in number of people who are claiming to be American citizens, and this is what it's called the paper sun phenomenon, where people were able to say, all my documents were burned, and so and they were able to, the reality is these were in many cases fraudulent claims. But the thing that happened there is this kind of there are these very vivid records and recollections in these scenes of the Chinese kind of wandering through the city and kind of being shunned and turned away and finally kind of being pushed to this area of the Presidio and a lot of people wanted to use that moment to finally say we're going to get rid of the Chinese Quarter, the Chinatown, and just raise this thing. But the Chinese were actually very shrewd and moved quickly and just started to rebuild and did it in some sophisticated ways, taking advantage of their understanding of the law and Chinatown was rebuilt.
Thank you. So maybe we'll turn it over to some questions.
Yeah, I'll grab your mic.
Who wants to start things off? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming. I just have a question regarding, you talk a lot about how, I took a push that was making me laugh because I know exactly what you're talking about. Talk about how in history there's a lot of things, specifically regarding Chinese history, but honestly, a lot of places in history that are not told the full story. Or how do you think, especially with our current political landscape, the American school system and the amount it, doesn't teach to its full capacity, how does that impact voting and just the way we're moving it? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. History is memory, and so I'm concerned about the way history is taught because of that, and I'm also have some larger concerns about the death of reading because I think reading is memory too, and yeah, I mean the thing that I hope for in this book and imagined in this book is I'm not the one who has coined this phrase, but Asian American history is American history. There's been a big push to include Asian American history in other, they call it ethnic studies curriculum in high school curriculums and in college curriculums. And history moves in cycles, and so maybe the optimistic view is that we will get past this period, and it'll be very interesting how, I mean, we're coming up on the, it's called, I think we call it at the New Yorker, the semi-quincentennial, the 250th birthday of America, and it'll be really interesting to see how the story of America is told in this July. But yeah, it's the thing that what I hope for in this book is that it's not just, I want people to buy the book, yes, because maybe ego, or it has to be commercially successful. But the thing about it is, I think it's buying the book is I want it's part of a larger movement or cause, and what I had hoped for in the book is, I have a Barnes and Nobles diagonally across the street from me, and I go to the history section, and I see, shelves full of books about World War II, Civil War, Civil Rights Movement. I don't really know where to find books about Asian American history, for example, and I think that my hope is that this book is on those shelves, and then that leads to other books by Asian American authors about Asian American subjects to being on those shelves too. I still think we have a ways to go. It's hard to sell books in this day and age, and I think I've benefited from so many things because because I work at the New Yorker, because I used to work at the New York Times, because I have a certain platform. But I even sort of feel that challenge of the way a book like this is seen, because it really is not meant for an Asian American audience or a Chinese American audience. It's meant for a general audience. So if you have a dad who likes the thing that my ideal audience is that dad who loves World War II history. Yeah, exactly. I want them to buy the book. So yeah.
I want to ask you about how you view systemic racism towards Asian Americans in schools, work, and also, do you think your book would help sort of mitigate or the effects, or let other people sort of reconsider how they view Asian Americans, their stereotypical views? Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to get into the hard questions. I think what you're alluding to is I think what you're alluding to is that there is in the fight over, for example, affirmative action in missions in colleges, there is this part of it is this the way that Asian Americans are left out of a lot of those discussions, and and the Supreme Court decision, which I have a lot of problems with, but actually Harvard did do some pretty did do some things that are not that shouldn't be proud of in the way it treats Asian American applicants. The thing that is that's interesting about the Asian American experience that I think is important to hold on to is you have to be able to hold on to two truths or multiple truths at once. When on selling this book and going on the book tour, I did an event in San Francisco that was kind of put together by a friend of mine who was full of kind of Silicon Valley powerhouse kind of Asian Americans. Like these were like CEOs and startup founders and kind of representation of like really successful Asian Americans. And yet at the same time, you know, I'm writing in this book about this history. I'm also touching upon, you know, some of my own personal experiences. And the word I use to describe the Asian American experience is one of precarity. And I think that when you look at history, there's a precarity to the Asian American experience, and I think the pandemic in that moment with where so many Asian Americans felt vulnerable, that was a moment when that precarity kind of came out, and that kind of precarity can be brought on from a range of different factors. It could be economic, could be, you know, a global pandemic, it could be political, and so I just think that if you know history and you read this history, I think that's just really important context. You know.
So
hopefully easier questions. Yeah.
Well, maybe so. More in line with your answer to the first question. A previous guest of the Writers Institute many years ago, Iris Chang, wrote a book about the Chinese in America.
Yeah, gorgeous book.
Yeah. How did that book inform your current book, or how does your book differ from that?
Yeah. I love that you brought up Iris Chang's book. So I mentioned that I wrote a piece for the New Yorker that touched on some of this history. This was the spring of 2021, and I drew on a couple of books, including Iris Chang's book, The Chinese in America, and another book by a Princeton professor named Beth Lou Williams called The Chinese Must Go, and another book by an author named Jean Failser who wrote a book called Driven Out that was about the driving out period. Iris Chang's, I hope people know who Iris Chang is. She wrote The Rape of Nanking, and this book, I had never heard of it until I started to research this history. It came out in the early, like 2001, 2002 or something like that, in the early 21st century. And I was kind of curious why it wasn't bigger and more well known. And if people know the tragic story of Iris Chang, she committed suicide shortly after this book came out, and some people think that it's she absorbed so much trauma in writing The Rape of Nanking, and also I think in working on this book on the Chinese in America. The thing that so her book is like very much a story of Chinese immigration and the story of the Chinese American overall. I actually conceived of my book as a narrative history of Chinese exclusion from the gold rush to the 1960s when my parents came. And anytime somebody approaches history, you're writing in a particular moment. And I was writing in this post-pandemic, post-anti-Asian hate and also now I'm writing in this new kind of anti-immigrant moment right now. And I wanted to explore how it was that, how our country responded when tens of thousands of people came from a distant land who spoke a different language, who didn't fit into this existing racial hierarchy, who had a different religion. How did we do? And try to understand how it was that it came to this, where a series of laws were passed to keep them out. The first laws that had ever been passed in American history that prevented people from immigrating to America based on their race. And I was hoping to, understand how it was that we got here. And so that, I think that there's a fair bit of overlap with the subject matter of Iris Chang's book, but my frame was different.
Hi, Michael. I'm curious, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 as a sense of exclusion, pain or darkness, and 10 as a sense of healing, inclusion, and brightness. Where are you now after your 2016's Go Back to China incident?
I don't know. So I guess I would say, like a 6 or a 7. I guess. I mean, that's a hard question to put on a scale. I think somebody else at an event asked if I still felt that sense of otherness, and I don't. That hasn't gone away. Like the interesting question is like what it will be like for my kids and what they will feel, and they obviously are growing up in New York, which is an incredibly diverse place. It's been a great privilege for me to have them come to these events to hear about this history and to think about these issues. I don't think it's going to go away for them either. And I think, again, I mentioned that concept of holding two truths in your the two things can be true at once. That there are a lot of doors that are open to them. There are a lot of opportunities for them, and yet they can still feel somehow outside of who gets to be an American. That theme of who gets to be an American is a theme that kind of runs through the book. It's the epigraph that opens the book, and it's a line that from Charles Yu, who wrote this book called Interior Chinatown. It's this gorgeous novel, and it's about a background actor in a TV police show called Black and White, about a black cop and a white cop, and the central character, his greatest aspiration in life is to go from being generic Asian man to kung fu guy. And so there's a scene where he's like kind of litigating his case in an imaginary courtroom, and he says, who gets to be an American? What does an American look like? Why do we keep falling out of the story even though we've been here for almost 200 years? And that's the question of the book, and I think that struggle will continue. I don't really know what it's like a parlor game to talk about and debate what it would take for that to end. There's a guy I've gotten to know, his name is Yao King, and he's given a lot to Asian American causes, and I had coffee with him. He organized a book event for me, and he was we were just kind of talking about what motivates him, and we were talking about this question of what it would take, and he has this very specific theory that it would take one Asian American who provides utility to like the majority of America. And meaning like a Michael Jordan who's Asian, or like not Jeremy Lin, but like an actor, or somebody that people get derive joy or utility, some sort of. That's what it would take. And I thought it was just really amusing because it was so specific, and it was such a specific theory that suddenly then that representation would be enough. I just don't really know the answer of what it would take to get me to a 10.
We'll probably just take this last question and
Yeah.
we can ask more questions outside of the time.
Right. But circling back to that, I guess to be an American question, one of the court cases brought up in the United States versus Wong Kim Park is a landmark decision that basically, has fun.
Yeah.
Foundational to having birthright citizenship in the U.S. nowadays. Do you think that case will be brought back into the light soon, given the political climate around questioning that idea?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously it already is. But the fascinating thing about the Wong Kim Mark case, there's a chapter in my book about Wong Kim Mark, is so what what was happening then. There was so Wong Kim Mark was born in San Francisco. Above this store. He was going back and forth between China and the United States, as was common back then. He every time you came back in, he would be questioned by immigration officials, and he would have to bring like proof that he was born in America. So he would bring these witness statements that said, "Oh yeah, I knew this family. He was born here. I remember," that kind of thing. So he brought this proof in, and they were questioning parts of his story. They're like, okay, fine, he is an American citizen, but the Justice Department and the customs officials who ran immigration back then wanted to bring a test case about whether the Chinese Americans who were born here actually qualified as citizens under the 14th Amendment. And what it was, the clause that they were talking about then was this clause so the 14th Amendment says, if you were born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, you are a citizen. And there's this kooky lawyer named George Collins who wrote this, who started to kind of advance this legal theory that Chinese weren't subject to the jurisdiction thereof because they're basically subjects of the Chinese Empire. And so he was kind of challenging that. Even though he was born in the United States, he's really not subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And actually, the Trump administration is making a similar case when it comes to certain people who are here, have temporary status, or children of undocumented immigrants. So it's fascinating to me to see that they're making a similar argument. Obviously, if folks aren't aware, in the end, the Supreme Court didn't rule on the merits of the case. They instead focused on this really technicality relating to universal injunctions and whether that was, and so they didn't rule on the heart of the case. It will come back up again. I would like to think that it's pretty clear, and I have faith in jurisprudence of the United States Supreme Court, but I don't know. It's frightening. I mean, one really cool thing, part of the book, is I actually recently met the grandson of Wong Kim Ark, and he's now in his 70s, and he actually for his whole life didn't really know the story, and it was like there was a member of the family who was trying to research their story, and they wound up showing up at the National Archives in San Bruno, and they said, and she came in, and everyone at the National Archives stood up and applauded, because then they said, this is, I think it was, her name was Nancy, she is the granddaughter of Wong Kim Ark, and they had been waiting for her. They were waiting for somebody to come in to, look at these documents, and so he is actually late in life. He's like in his late 70s, and he's become kind of like this champion of birthright citizenship and remembering this history. And so it's fascinating to me to see that this case is being fought over again.